Hello everyone, and welcome to the 221st episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring our patron and member pick for March 2025, Magneto from the X-Men film franchise. Like many comic book characters, there have been many variations of Magneto brought into existence over the years, each offering their own strengths and weaknesses to the character. But Ian McKellen's portrayal of this classic villain is without a doubt one of the best, so it's no wonder the members and patrons wanted to see him covered this month. We have a lot to discuss, so I say we just get right into it. But before or after this episode, be sure to check out my new gaming channel by following the link down in the description, or by clicking the card on your screen if that's something you're interested in. Now without further ado, let's begin. Our history is replete with tragedies unending. Go back as far as you possibly can, and you'll find strife and misfortune. And chances are, if you walk outside your door for more than 10 minutes, you'll find plenty still. Some tragedies, however, etch themselves into our collective consciousness more severely than others. Such is the case with the myriad tragedies unleashed during the events leading up to the Second World War, and the exponentially more horrific ones that occurred as it raged across entire continents. Not only was the loss of life that came as a result of the more widely accepted horrors of war gargantuan, but the Holocaust, the systematic imprisonment and extermination of millions of people by the Third Reich and its allies, took the atrocities one might expect to occur during a war to the next level. Now, the crime that was the Holocaust will no doubt go down as one of the greatest crimes a group of people ever committed against another. But as with all things, the passage of time will inevitably ensure that new events will steadily lessen the pervasiveness of old ones in our collective consciousness. However, at the time of this video's release, World War II only ended nearly 80 years ago, less than a fraction of a millisecond in the grand scheme of things. And so not only is this relatively recent and horrifying event still at the forefront of our minds, but so it is in the minds of the people who were affected by it, with upwards of 200,000 people still living at the time of this video's release that still remember the horror they endured at the hands of one of, if not the most evil regimes to ever exist. People who remember the brands they were given like cattle, the unthinkable housing conditions they lived in, the ache in their stomachs as they tried to survive on the scraps given them by their overlords, the brutal labor they were forced to conduct day after day, and the torture and murder of their loved ones that they witnessed with their very own eyes. And this world of unending torment these people endured for years was the very same endured by Eric Lehnsherr, the man who would become Magneto. Eric, like many Jews his age, was taken from his home and sent off to a concentration camp, and in his case, the most famous one of all, Auschwitz. Separated from his parents upon his arrival, Eric was seemingly spared from suffering through the same torment his fellow inmates experienced, something that may seem fortunate at a glance, but is perhaps more unfortunate when you consider why he was spared: the manifestation of his powers upon his arrival, and his subsequent status as the pet project of Sebastian Shaw. Masquerading as Dr. Klaus Schmidt, Shaw was an exceptionally powerful mutant who was eager to conquer the world, so he might then usher in a new age of mutant supremacy at the expense of every other human life. And in his efforts to do so, he was in the business of recruiting other powerful mutants to aid him in his endeavors. In Eric, he saw one such powerful mutant, a boy with the incredible ability to control metal in any way he wished. And so Shaw ensured that Eric's time spent at the camp would mostly be spent on unlocking the secrets of his powers, so he might be transformed into a loyal soldier in the war to come. However, at this time in his life, Eric was only capable of manifesting his powers under extreme duress, so in order to bring out his latent talents, Shaw chose to threaten Eric's mother at gunpoint to try and coax him into a frenzy that would allow him to use his powers. And when that didn't work, he shot her, subsequently sending Eric into a maddening rage that saw him kill 2 men and destroy Shaw's office. Now, since we know that Eric came to the camp in 1944, he couldn't have been there for more than about a year and a half. But that was plenty of time for him to suffer gross amounts of abuse at the hands of Shaw, who stated after Eric put on this display of power that they were going to do great things together by training him through instilling great anger and pain within him. And who knows what kind of horror Shaw unleashed upon Eric to do so. Regardless, Eric undoubtedly suffered mightily at the hands of Shaw, and after the war was over, and he matured into a well-trained and capable adult, Eric chose to take a path that only made all too much sense for him to take, considering everything he had been put through: the path of revenge. Scouring the world for any traces of former collaborators in his efforts to reach Shaw, Eric likely had a hand in murdering many former members of the party who were complicit in his suffering and the suffering of his people. A life of constant rage that mired Eric's mind in pain as he focused all his efforts on righting the wrongs of his past. Now, as far as the morality of Eric's choice to dedicate his life to revenge goes, there are a few things to consider here. First of all, it's not exactly wrong that he should try and pursue the criminals who helped to prop up that horrid regime, as many efforts were made by numerous individuals and organizations after the war ended to find those who had escaped justice and bring them to it. So the problem here isn't necessarily that he's pursuing these people, it's the way he's doing it. Eric isn't apprehending these people and then bringing them in so they might be judged and sentenced according to their crimes. He's pursuing them so he can murder them with his own hands. Admittedly, death was likely an appropriate punishment for all the men Eric may have murdered over the years. But it's not their punishment that's the problem here. It's the fact that Eric went from being unwillingly thrust into a world of horror to then choosing to live in one that was similarly centered around horror. We've talked about this many times on this channel. But no matter whether you're murdering criminals who deserve death or not, killing another person is something that will always have an effect on you, no matter what. It's no easy thing to take another person's life, and even when you have to do so in self-defense, more often than not, the trauma associated with committing such an act will leave you mentally scarred in one way or another. And with Eric going from being surrounded by death to being a dealer of it, the scars etched into his mind have only deepened and become more pronounced. So the evil here is not necessarily the fact that Eric is killing these men, but that he continuously pushes himself further down a dark path that's liable to destroy him, innocent people caught in the crossfire, or anyone he might come to care about in the future. And well, all of those things would end up happening over the course of his life. When Eric finally reaches Shaw, he proves to be no match for his powers, as well as those of his minions, the Hellfire Club. But as chance would have it, this bout with Shaw would lead to him being introduced to Dr. Charles Xavier, a man who for a time managed to temper Eric's thirst for vengeance and point his efforts towards dealing with his enemies in a more honorable and less personally destructive way. Despite his efforts to aid Charles in finding other mutants, so they might band together and meet the challenges facing their people in a similarly honorable and compassionate way, the pain of Eric's past is more often than not etched into his features as he tries to navigate this new world of love and acceptance that he's never experienced before. However, as noble as Charles and his efforts were at this time, one significant thing that separated Charles and Eric in these early days was the notion that Charles was trying to slowly integrate mutants into human society, and in his efforts to do so, he tried to ensure that any mutant he was allied with, like Mystique, hid their powers as best they could in order to bolster their chances of being accepted by other humans. Eric, however, who had not only been tormented at the hands of people who believed he was an inferior person due to his status as a Jew, but who also had to contend with the typical stigma associated with being a mutant, firmly believed that no man should feel as if they need to hide who they are from the world at large, and that in fact, one should be proud of who they are, no matter what they are, and who might think less of them. As virtuous as that is though, to take such a stance at that time was ultimately folly, as unfortunately, humans are more often than not going to meet revelations like the existence of superpowered mutants with hostility rather than open arms. To learn that the world you live in contains people who could lop your head off with the flick of a finger isn't exactly heartwarming news to receive for the average human, especially when those people could be hiding in plain sight. So while Eric's line of thinking here was definitely correct, what he believes should more so have been considered the end goal of mutant civil rights efforts, rather than the foundations of it, as proving to the world that mutants are no different than any other person, in a slow and gentle way, is far more effective than simply bursting onto the scene and declaring, "We exist, deal with it." And Eric's inability to see how harmful his beliefs were, to not only himself, but the mutant cause, would lead him to becoming the villain we know him to be, the dreaded Magneto. Despite Charles' efforts, by the time the final confrontation with Shaw arrives, Eric can't help but sink back into his old ways, as the pain and trauma he experienced at the hands of this man overrode any sense of mercy he may have held in this situation, and so he chose to murder Shaw when given the opportunity. And now we've arrived at the horrid tragedy of Eric Lensher. For when he meets Shaw, he confirms something that he's known all along, that everything that dreaded man put him through made him stronger, made him into the weapon he is today. A cold hard truth that Eric not only acknowledges, but embraces. Not only does he embrace this, but through experiencing the life of a being that's considered anathema to his own people, Eric has concluded that the humans only fear mutants because they fear losing their supremacy, that mutant kind is the next stage of evolution for the human race, and all resistance to that reality must be met with brutal action in the absence of acceptance and coexistence. Strength and force of will can be achieved through love, cooperation, support, and discipline, but it can also be wrought by hardship, strife, misery, and suffering. And as a man molded by the latter, and one who will never stand idly by whilst others claim him to be a threat that needs to be eliminated, Eric has fully embraced the ideology of the people who harmed him the most, molding it from one that claimed the superiority of the Aryan race into one that claims the superiority of the mutant race. And that is the great tragedy of Eric's character, that his trauma has pushed him to become a man like the ones he's dedicated much of his life to destroying, and a hypocrite of the highest order. After being given further confirmation that his worldview was correct, when the US and Soviet navies chose to fire all their ordnance at the X-Men following Shaw's defeat, Eric's story would end up progressing in two different directions due to a timeline fracture. Magneto goes on to form the Brotherhood of Mutants, an organization dedicated to enacting his vision of bringing about the advent of mutant supremacy, and in both, Magneto ends up getting incarcerated for supposedly being complicit in Kennedy's assassination. However, Kennedy was a mutant, and Magneto wasn't guiding Oswald's bullets, as the government assumed, but was actually attempting to alter their trajectory to save the president's life. In the original timeline, Magneto was released or broken out from prison at an unknown date. After putting aside his differences with Charles and visiting a young Jean Grey, he continued to pursue his path of eventual mutant world domination. In the year 2000, the time finally came for Magneto to put his plans into action. As a US Senator, Senator Kelly was attempting to enact a law that would require mutants to register themselves with the government. And drawing parallels between his actions and the actions of the Nazi regime, Magneto chose to act. Kidnapping Senator Kelly and utilizing a machine he had manufactured to imbue him with a mutation using his own magnetic powers to do just that to every other powerful person in the country to force them into accepting the reality that mutants were not only here to stay, but were to become the new rulers of this planet. However, the strain on him was so great during this process that turning Senator Kelly nearly killed him. And so in an attempt to ensure his plot's success while preserving his own life, he kidnapped Rogue so he could transfer his powers to her and power the machine using her life instead of his, along the way committing numerous atrocities for the sake of his goals, like torturing Wolverine to find Rogue. Now at one point, Magneto says to Professor X that he's still unwilling to make sacrifices, and that's what makes him weak. However, Logan points out during the final bout with Magneto in the first film that if he were really so righteous, it would be him in that machine, and not Rogue. But like all men who use violence, terror, and overwhelming power to achieve their goals, Magneto had become a man who didn't just want to preserve mutant kind and usher in a golden age of mutant supremacy, but a man who wanted to rule over that golden age as its rightful king, believing himself to be the only man capable of creating and maintaining the world he wished to manifest. And because he had now transitioned into a mixture of freedom fighter and megalomaniac, he was more than willing to sacrifice other lives for his cause, but not his own. A further stain on his character that only highlights the hypocrisy of his words and actions. Despite this, there is a moment before Rogue is placed in the machine where we see that Magneto is not all violence and horror, and is a man who, despite his actions, is one who holds within him a great compassion for his people. As after commenting on the notion that America was going to be the land of tolerance and peace, when he's speaking with Rogue asks him if he's going to kill her. Though he looks uncomfortable at the question, he says yes, and that he's going to do so because there is no land of tolerance. There is no peace, not here or anywhere else. Women and children, whole families destroyed, simply because they were born different from those in power, and that after tonight, those in power will become like them, and thus allied to their cause, a small sacrifice to make in the face of mutant supremacy. And there, despite his compassion, lies the issue. For those words are but an echo of the trauma he's lived with since he was a young boy, and because of all that he's experienced, he cannot find it in himself to see that sacrificing some for the sake of your compassion for the rest is not the proper path, nor is it liable to end well for anyone involved. Because of these things, he doesn't want understanding, he wants supremacy. He doesn't want coexistence, he wants dominance. He doesn't want peace, he wants vengeful justice. And he has corrupted so many people to his cause with his poisonous words of hostility and violence towards those who have not yet found their way to accepting them for who they are. Professor X is not just a fantastic foil for Magneto because he represents good and he represents evil, but because each of them are perfect representations of love and the dire corruption of love, that is hatred. Professor X takes in the disenfranchised, provides them with love, and implores them to see the good in themselves and the humans who have been so led astray by their fears. Magneto takes them and infans the fires of their hatred and disillusionment, so he might point them towards violence and vengeance to right the wrongs that have been committed against them. Aside from their respective recruitment efforts, one of the best examples of the difference between the two in this regard is how Charles even meets Magneto with love and compassion, even in the face of all his crimes, consistently trying to turn his erstwhile friend back to the side of reason and love so he might save him. Another fantastic example of the differences between their approaches and how wrong Magneto's is can be found at the conclusion of the first film. After the dust is settled and Magneto is safely tucked away in a prison cell, Charles pays a visit to him, and when Magneto asks him if the feeling that someday they'll pass that foolish law Senator Kelly tried to enact, or one just like it, wakes him in the middle of the night, the idea that they will come for him and his children, Charles replies that it does, and when Magneto asks what he does when he wakes up to that, he says he feels a great swell of pity for the poor soul who comes to that school looking for trouble. The main difference between the two in this regard is that, like most people, Charles will do whatever it takes to protect himself and the people under his care. But when it comes to taking violent action to do so, he sees it as the last line of defense, whereas Magneto believes it should be their first option. And well, look where that got him. Despite his defeat at the end of this film though, the allies he'd gathered over the years ensured his eventual release. And so it was when Mystique found a way to free him in the wake of the actions of Colonel William Stryker, a man who was attempting to eliminate what he believed to be the mutant problem by exterminating all of them through the use of Cerebro. And in the face of such adversity, Magneto ended up allying himself with the X-Men to stop Stryker. As noble as that was initially, when push came to shove and Stryker was defeated, he saw a perfect opportunity to solve his humanity problem once and for all, using Cerebro himself to target average humans so he could exterminate them all in one fell swoop, leaving only mutants behind to inherit the Earth. But fortunately, he stopped before he can put this plan into action. While you're talking about organizing committees, the extermination has already begun. A quote from Magneto that sums up his actions thus far and the actions he would continue to take as his story unfolds, but one that also highlights the fallacies of his worldview as Professor X and his X-Men continue to see results despite not towing the violent line that Magneto wishes them to. In Last Stand, when a cure is unveiled for mutants, Magneto of course sees it as a threat, ignoring the fact that there are mutants out there like Rogue who suffer greatly due to their powers, and so he attempts to use the overwhelming might of Jean Grey, as well as his own reformed Brotherhood of Mutants, to stop the cure from being unleashed, in the process causing the death of Charles, something that he deeply regrets, yet doesn't push his mind away from the horrible path he's chosen to follow, which is evident as he makes his way to Alcatraz to stop the cure from being unleashed, murdering many innocents in the process. Despite his best efforts though, he fails again, and he fails so catastrophically that he himself is cured of his powers, forced afterwards to contemplate his many mistakes and live as any other ordinary man, just as broken, if not more so, before he became the man he is at the end of this film. However, at some point, he did recover his powers, and being backed into a corner by the advent of a dystopian world where the horrifying machines of Boulevard Trask murdered any and all mutants they encountered, Magneto once again found himself on the side of the X-Men, and regretting all the years he had spent fighting against Charles and his allies. With the help of Logan and Kitty Pryde though, the horror of these machines is eventually prevented when Logan manages to stop Boulevard from becoming a martyr after he's murdered by Mystique, an endeavor that was partly aided by Magneto when he was broken out of the cell he was placed in following Kennedy's assassination. Here is where the timeline split as I mentioned earlier, and while Magneto initially seems eager to follow the same path as his alternate self, when he nearly murders Nixon in his cabinet, he ends up being stopped by the very woman who nearly destroyed their futures. And after this, we get a glimpse of who Eric might have been had he not been so consumed by pain and rage. Following his escape from his pursuers in the United States, Eric makes his way back to his homeland of Poland, starting a family with a woman named Magda and raising a daughter named Nina. Despite his peaceful existence though, we're given quite the sad example of how one's crimes eventually catch up to them when the people of his town discover his true identity and end up accidentally murdering both his wife and child. After this occurs, he's spirited away to immerse himself in his pain to amplify his powers by the dreaded Apocalypse in much the same way Shaw once did in the very same place, afterwards becoming one of his horsemen and unleashing destruction and devastation on a grand scale that ends up causing the deaths of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. After being coaxed out of his rage by Raven though, he manages to right some of the wrongs he had just committed and earns himself a plot of land to do with as he sees fit, as a thanks for his assistance. Though when Jean ends up killing Raven and the new power she's gathered turn her into a massive threat, Eric becomes Magneto once more and descends upon her with vengeful fury, though he eventually aids in stopping the true threat, the Dabari, from destroying humanity and claiming the Earth as their own. In both these timelines, Magneto unleashes atrocity after atrocity upon our planet and our people. And after rifling through all this information, what is there to say about the man who became Magneto? He was a young boy who had to endure the horrors of the Holocaust, one who then was conditioned to become a weapon for a madman who had similar ambitions to the people who had destroyed Eric's life in the first place, completely altering whoever Eric might have been had he not experienced those things. Eric went on to become a man so focused on wrathful vengeance that he destroyed himself ever further with each passing day, eventually evolving into a man who focused all his energy on becoming a person not too much unlike those who had harmed him in the first place. As Magneto, Eric was smug, self-righteous, haughty, condescending, and utterly without mercy. a man who would have murdered nearly everyone living to ensure that the horrors he experienced would never harm his people ever again. And in doing so, he became a being so entrenched in maddening hypocrisy who could not see that the crimes he was committing in the name of justice and freedom were just as bad, if not worse, than the ones perpetrated against him and his people. But in doing so, he proved in each endeavor that he took that he was wrong. Shaw was a threat who needed to be dealt with, but was one that could have been dealt with without resorting to violence that further poisons one's character, and in a way that showed the world that mutants were essential to its prosperity and not the other way around. Bolivar Trask, who was eventually incarcerated after he was found to be selling secrets to foreign governments, did not have to be killed to stop his plot from harming mutants. And in fact, we learned that killing him would have only made it worse. Apocalypse, whose plans could have easily saw the world descending into an age of destruction and darkness that would have been much like the one that unfolded in the future after Bolivar's death, was a megalomaniacal maniac who would have sundered all before him for the sake of power, and he was not someone who one should have willingly allied themselves to, no matter what. Jean was a woman whose powers were dangerous, yes, but one who clearly could be coaxed into a stable state through acceptance rather than hostility, and she was not someone, no matter her accidental crimes, who deserved to die for the sake of revenge. Senator Kelly and his proposed law were a threat, but one that could have been easily dealt with through the proper channels if Magneto hadn't interfered. Stryker was also a threat, one who was taken down by the joint efforts of the Brotherhood and the X-Men, thus proving that when a threat arises, it can be dealt with at the time, meaning that Magneto's eliminate all who might become a threat and ask questions later method of doing things is ultimately unnecessary. The cure, though something that could be forced upon mutants to eliminate them, had many benefits that could have helped mutants who needed it, and it was clearly something that could be tempered through communication and understanding to bring humans and mutants closer together. Not the opposite. But after taking into account everything we know about Magneto, when it comes down to it, what we've learned is that Magneto could have been so much more. He was the man who initially helped to form the X-Men. He was the man who helped Professor X build the incredible machine that is Cerebro. He was a man with a magnificent set of powers who could have used those powers to embolden and protect the lives of others in any number of infinite ways. But most of all, he was a man who held within him a deep compassion for his people, a man who experienced utter horror and lived a life that constantly reminded him of his trauma, that pushed him into taking dread action on their behalf. But a man who could have easily used his compassion to better the world instead of turning it towards a misguided pursuit for power and supremacy. In the end, the life of Eric Lehnsherr is one of tragedy on many fronts. The tragedy of a boy forced to experience the terrors of the Holocaust, and more. The tragedy of a man whose pain pushed him to being just like those who had hurt him in the first place. And the tragedy of a man so misguided that he could not see that all his efforts to protect his people was only causing them further harm. And these are the reasons why the young boy, who was warped into the arch-villain that is Magneto, will forever serve as one of the most heart-wrenching examples of a man with so much promise being corrupted beyond measure and falling into a dark pit of never-ending and all-consuming evil. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on Magneto? Did I miss anything? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured while you're at it. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up button, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, my patrons, my members, anyone who's decided to honor me with a super thank, and especially Elijah Kai VA, our Dark Lord channel member, and a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and subreddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.